This is today's keynote address, and it's going to be given by Alwyn Turner, who's one of our leading contemporary historians, has written, apart from anything else, has written a terrific trilogy of books, one on the 1970s, one on the 1980s, and one on the 1990s. Apart from anything else I would say about Alwyn, his grasp of popular culture is, I think, unrivaled among contemporary historians. We did a session together, never had it so good, earlier this afternoon, and listening to Alwyn was a real treat, and I'm looking forward to more of the same. So over to you. And there should be time for questions at the end. We have to finish by 7:15, I gather.
Yes, good afternoon. I don't propose spending too long on contemporary politics, but I thought since we are in an election campaign, I just wanted to draw one comparison about how things have changed. So this is a somewhat distorted shot of the ITV leaders debate from a couple of weeks ago. 7 party leaders, and their average age is 47. If you go back 6 decades to the 1951 general election, and the average age of party leaders then was 71, nearly a quarter of a century older. Politics, like so much else in Britain at the time, was an old man's game, dominated by an old boys' network. And from this distance, both the age and the gender of the players are inescapable. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the people who had been called upon to fight in the Second World War were not overly impressed to find that the Britain they returned to was still being run by a generation of men old enough to have served in the Boer War. And the 1950s is the decade when the term the establishment first becomes popular, and the decade in which the rebellion against the establishment begins. It's the decade that sees the comedy revolution of Spike Milligan, Tony Hancock and Peter Cook, and the rise of the angry young men in literature and theatre. And it's also the decade that sees the arrival of rock and roll. And I wanted to look at this phenomenon in particular because I think it illustrates some important aspects of Britain in the post-war decades. So the release in 1955 of the film Rock Around the Clock, starring Bill Haley and his Comets, was greeted with great trepidation in Britain. It was capable, warned the Liberal MP Jeremy Thorpe, of piercing the thin shell of civilization and turning people into wild dervishes. The Times, meanwhile, shuddered at the heavy pulsing beat of this latest derivative of Negro blues and at the moaning suggestiveness of most of its songs. The musical establishment was no more enthusiastic. There's nothing new or wonderful about it, according to Sir Malcolm Sargent, who conducted the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Rock and roll has been played in the jungle for years. And the band leader Ted Heath, not to be confused with the future Tory Prime Minister, didn't think it would catch on at all because, you see, it's primarily for the coloured population. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail, as progressive and forward-thinking then as it is now, ran a front-page editorial wondering whether rock and roll was the Negro's revenge. And you can see in these comments a fear of sex, obviously, that moaning suggestiveness of the Times, but mostly you can taste the terror of black culture. You'll note, however, that Bill Haley himself was not actually black, and nor were most of those who immediately followed in his wake. So why this obsessive focus, this insistence on a racial interpretation of the music? There are, I think, 2 key reasons. First, there's the fact that 7 years on from the arrival of the Empire Windrush, immigration from the West Indies was, in 1955, starting to reach the tens of thousands a year. The initial welcome that had been extended was now starting to turn towards suspicion. And second, there was the rise of independence movements in various African colonies, suggesting that the end of the British Empire was coming quicker than anybody had anticipated. Hence that musical Mau Mau comment by Jeremy Thorpe, directly linking rock and roll to the struggle in Kenya. Race in Britain was becoming an issue in the 1950s in a way not previously seen. And there was a fear that white British youth would be contaminated by black American culture. This is the same argument, you'll remember, that was deployed by David Starkey in the wake of the riots in 2011, which he blamed on the influence of gangster rap. And just in parentheses, that was a long-standing complaint. 70 years earlier, in 1941, a report by magistrates had made precisely the same point in relation to what was then called juvenile delinquency. The report said, children should not be allowed to see what are generally called gangster pictures, in which thieves and robbers are held up as heroes. So that concern had been around for a while about the younger generation going a bit wild, but in the 1950s, the concern had the added new ingredient of race. It's worth noting, incidentally, that most of this commentary came in response to Bill Haley and his Comets, a good time dance band who don't appear particularly threatening by modern standards. The really dangerous stuff was yet to come with the unholy trinity of Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard and Elvis Presley. Now there really was something to worry about. Reading from left to right, you've got a hard-drinking, pill-popping hellraiser from Louisiana who at the age of 22 was already on his third marriage, this time bigamously to his 13-year-old cousin. You've got a black bisexual wailing like a banshee, wearing makeup and calling himself the Georgia Peach. And you've got the hip-swiveling, charismatic truck driver who turned out to be the single most powerful figure in 20th century culture. But I want to return to Bill Haley, because in February 1957, Bill Haley and his Comets arrived in Britain for their first British tour. And it was also the first British tour by any American group since the war. Just to explain, there'd been a dispute between the Musicians' Union in Britain and the Musicians' Union in America, which had prevented bands from one country playing in the other. Singers were okay as long as they used local musicians to back them up, but not groups. And this little odd, curious little protectionist Cold War began to thaw out in 1956, and a new agreement ended the hostility. Bill Haley and his Comets were the first American act to benefit. They came to Britain, and in return, we sent them the band of Ted Heath, still not to be confused with the future Tory Prime Minister. So on that tour of America, Heath, who you'll remember had talked about the music of the coloured population, encountered for himself the reality of American racism. Segregation was still common in the southern states, and the band played some concerts to whites-only audiences. One of them was in Alabama and seemed to be going perfectly fine until Heath introduced his guest star for the evening, the black American singer Nat King Cole. And at that point, several members of the audience got up on stage and began to beat up the singer. The concert came to an abrupt end. 3 further gigs were cancelled, and the musicians retired to the comparative safety of Chicago. When charges were brought against 6 of the men who had assaulted Nat King Cole, it turned out that they were members of a group called the White Citizens Council, followers of a man named Asa Carter, who barely shows up in this light, which is possibly a good thing. This is a man who had left the Ku Klux Klan because he thought it was a bit on the moderate side to found a radical, much more violent chapter. Now, Carter didn't approve of jazz, clearly, but he really, really hated rock and roll, which he saw as part of a communist plot. Communist-infiltrated groups, he said, are waging psychological war for the minds of children and teenagers by attempting to integrate the white with the Negro. For much the same reason, J. Edgar Hoover ordered FBI agents to dig up some dirt on Bill Haley in an attempt to discredit him, though obviously there was no dirt to be found. Unlike Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, Haley was a clean-living rock star. But meanwhile, rock and roll was being denounced on the other side of the Iron Curtain in precisely the same terms. According to the official state newspaper for young people in East Germany, rock and roll was part of an American psychological war to infect a part of the population with an outlook of inhumanity. It was a preparation for war. And you get exactly the same phrasing, this psychological warfare that is being waged. So in America, rock and roll is seen as a communist plot to undermine capitalism. And in Eastern Europe, it's seen as a capitalist plot to undermine communism. In Britain, as we've seen, the right disliked rock and roll because it was black, and the left, well, the left had trouble believing that anybody could fall for such childish commercialism in the first place. Anyone over the age of 15 who liked rock and roll was mentally rather retarded, in the elegant words of Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. Instead, Hobsbawm, like a lot of the left-minded artists and intellectuals of his generation, championed revivalist jazz. And in late 1950s Britain, a class and educational divide opens up. Working-class youth from the secondary moderns liked rock and roll. Sixth form students at grammar schools liked the trad jazz that grew out of revivalist jazz. The real issue, though, right across the political spectrum in Britain, was a fear of creeping Americanism. This stuff, trad jazz, was okay, because although trad was American, it was rooted in the 1920s music of New Orleans and Chicago. It was a style that was now safely dead and was therefore available to be curated. But contemporary American culture, that was very different indeed. It was commercial, it was popular, it was dangerous. David, in his most recent book, quotes one of Eric Hobsbawm's columns in which he denounced the contemporary jazz of Miles Davis for what he called self-pity and the denial of love. We'll return to rock and roll in a moment, but at this stage I just want to take a slight detour into broadcasting, because the popularity of American culture was a particular concern for the BBC. The corporation had been scared of Americanization for years, going back to the 1930s when Radio Luxembourg had first broken the BBC's broadcasting monopoly in Britain. In the late 1940s, the Director General of the BBC, William Haley, not to be confused obviously with Bill Haley, had a stern word with the Light programme, the equivalent of today's Radio 2, and he warned the station to take care with its broadcasting style. We don't want to be ultra-nationalistic, he said, but we don't want to end up with just a pale copy of American radio. These days, if William Haley is remembered, he is mostly remembered for the fact that in 1946, he created the third programme, the equivalent of today's Radio 3. And the remit of this new station was to celebrate the high culture of Western Europe and to defend it against American commercialism. This was a conscious attempt to combat the pernicious transatlantic influence. Haley talked about a pyramid of culture, which was reflected in the output of BBC Radio. At the bottom was the Light programme, the equivalent of Radio 2, then the Home Service, the equivalent of today's Radio 4, and sitting proudly at the summit was the third programme, the home of classical music, poetry, serious drama, and lectures by academics. And the idea, Haley argued, was that ultimately everybody could be won over to appreciating high culture. The listener must be led, he explained, from good to better by curiosity, liking, and a growth of understanding. As the standards of the education and culture of the community rise, so should the programme pyramid rise as a whole. So the idea was not simply that you were providing music for the masses, it was that through doing so, you would encourage them to listen to something better than they already were listening to. And that's the same intention to be found in the Arts Council, which was founded in the same year, in 1946. The first chairman of the Arts Council was the liberal economist Maynard Keynes, and he spelt out his message in his inaugural address to the Arts Council with the great slogan, "Death to Hollywood." The same attitude was evident in the early 1950s when the Conservative government proposed the introduction of commercial television. The Labour Party opposed the idea, largely because they thought it would be crass and American. So Labour went into the 1955 election promising that they would repeal the Television Act that permitted commercial TV. It hadn't quite started broadcasting, although the act had been passed. The Labour Party said they would repeal this act and keep us safely tucked up in a one-channel, state-approved world. and perhaps unsurprisingly, Labour lost that election. More than that, they actually lost very badly indeed. They lost seats to the incumbent government with a swing to the Conservatives. And by 1958, the Tories were making political capital out of the way that they were the party that believed in choice, as seen in this poster of a happy family watching and choosing between BBC or ITV. The Labour Party seemed to learn very little from this experience. In the 1960s, it was a Labour government that closed down the pirate radio stations following a long campaign led by Tony Benn, then the Postmaster General. And in the 1970s, the Labour opposition revived all the same arguments they'd used against commercial TV when a Tory government introduced commercial radio. And then again in the 1980s, with the advent of satellite television, the complaints were dragged once more around the block. I should add that there were, of course, Tories who opposed the Americanisation of British broadcasting as well, but the relative industrial decline of Britain was becoming so apparent even as early as the 1950s that the new breed of Conservative were looking across the Atlantic for an example of brash, vibrant enterprise. You might have to hold your nose a little, but this was how to reinvigorate British business. And it was always possible to take refuge in Harold Macmillan's famous formulation that Britain was the ancient Greece to America's Rome. We were more mature, more cultured, more civilized, while the Americans were, in Macmillan's words, great big, vulgar, bustling people. I think it's worth restating that there were very clear divisions in Britain over this issue of American influence. The working class, and particularly the young working class, happily embraced Hollywood, commercial television and rock and roll, and didn't seem to have the same reverence towards high culture, high West European culture that was expected of them. In 1950, the Cadbury Trust produced a report with the self-explanatory title 80,000 Adolescents, a Study of Young People in Birmingham, and it observed, it is almost astounding that in the list of radio programmes to which these young people, 80,000 of them, remember, the radio programmes to which these young people listen, there should be only one mention of the third programme. In 1946, a mass observation study asked British people to describe Americans. Older people used words like boastfulness, materialism, and immaturity. But younger people talked about energy, enterprise, generosity, and efficiency. This was the future. The left in Britain, I'd suggest, was politically misguided in trying to resist what was coming. That's, I think, fairly obvious, since the left lost not only the battle, but the war. More than that, though, I think the left harmed itself by adopting a paternalist, patronising attitude that failed to connect with the people it was seeking to represent. I'm reminded of, there's a moment in Tony Benn's diaries when he goes to see Fulham playing Chesterfield and admits that it's the first time he's ever been to a football match. And this is in 1989, nearly 40 years after he was first elected as a Labour MP. And he was only going on that occasion in order to receive a petition that Chesterfield fans had brought down to London for him. And it kind of makes you wonder, in all those years, was he never even curious about football? Did he have no interest at all in this activity that lay so close to the cultural heart of the working class? I mean, not obviously that we want necessarily to see politicians desperately flaunting their man of the people credentials and telling us that they support a particular club and have done since they were 3 years old. And there's something deeply embarrassing about David Cameron talking about how he wants to see his team, Aston Villa, secure a couple of gains, as he calls it. I mean, this isn't really how football fans tend to talk, and Tory MPs don't half look stupid when they urge their team to go for it. I mean, it simply doesn't ring true. Mind you, yesterday, David Cameron did say that we now had the lowest rate of unemployment since 1975, the year in which he bought a Bay City Rollers album. And that might actually be true. When he said that he liked the Smiths, Johnny Marr famously said, banned him from ever listening to the group again. I mean, I think the nation waits to hear what Les McEwen has to say on the subject of the Bay City Rollers. But anyway, to return to rock and roll. This is the BBC's prime pop music show in 1955, the year that rock and roll arrived in Britain. Lord, you can barely see it, but nonetheless. Off the Record, it's called, and it was hosted by the man you can just about see in the middle, veteran dance band leader Jack Payne, and it featured a large chorus and an orchestra, complete with a harp, and they played renditions of popular hits of the day, and they had occasional guest appearances. And it fell to Jack Payne to be the man, much to his evident distaste, to introduce the first rock performance on British television with the screen debut of Tommy Steele, our very own imitation of Elvis. And Jack Payne introduced him with the immortal words, said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have rock and roll. Personally, I can take it or leave it." Which is not the most auspicious start to Tommy Steele's career, but he seems to have recovered. And that's very much the attitude of the corporation at the time. Bill Haley had his first hits in Britain without getting a single play on BBC radio or television. They were heard in Britain only because they were being played on Radio Luxembourg. But despite Eric Hobsbawm's disapproval, not everyone who listened to rock and roll was a complete simpleton. And in due course, British acts began to take on and then take over this music. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Kinks, others led a youth revolution in culture. And they also established, for the next 3 decades at least, that rock and roll, this unloved little sibling of proper grown-up music, was going to be at the core of British cultural life. And eventually, even the establishment was forced to take notice. Most famously, the Beatles were each awarded an MBE by the Labour government of Harold Wilson in 1965. But I think it's worth noting that this was in recognition of their export earnings rather than as any recognition of their artistic achievement. And it wasn't a move that was actually greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm within the Labour Party itself. In her diary, the Cabinet Minister Barbara Castle reported that, quotes, "The reaction among Labour MPs was wholly unfavourable, the word gimmick being prominent." Meanwhile, the BBC had simply abandoned its attempt to improve public taste. Faced with the challenge of shows like Ready, Steady, Go on ITV, the BBC responded in 1964 with a programme, Top of the Pops, that lasted for over 40 years. But it was also a show that illustrated the fact that the BBC had really no idea at all what to do with this new cultural mood that had settled on the nation. Ready, Steady, Go on ITV went out in search of the hippest and best new music and dancers to put on TV. Top of the Pops, on the other hand, had no agenda at all. It simply put on the screens whatever records people happened to have bought last week in the hope that the masses kind of knew what they were doing. The pendulum had swung from one extreme to the other. All that was left, it seemed, of the old BBC paternalism was the atmosphere of the show. It was like a fifth form disco run and overseen by the teachers. The 4 regular hosts of the programme, Alan Freeman, David Jacobs, Pete Murray and Jimmy Savile, between them, when the show started, they had an average age of 37. The average age of the performers on the first edition of the show was 21. There was this big generation gap between those who were allowed to be the custodians of the music and the musicians themselves. Meanwhile, over on Ready, Steady, Go, the big star, the presenter, was the 20-year-old Cathy McGowan. This is why Ready, Steady, Go was a better programme. And the same sense of resignation on the part of the BBC could be seen in 1967 when the pirate radio stations were finally closed down. The corporation simply hired I was going to say a small platoon of pirate DJs, but platoon is probably a bit army rather than naval. Anyway, they hired a handful of pirate DJs and asked them to recreate as much of the style as was decently possible. On the fab news station Radio 1, the Daily Mirror claimed that this completely transformed the image of the BBC. No longer was it to be regarded as auntie, it was now, quotes, a flower-powered swinging chick in a micro-skirt. But within that, if you look closely enough, the old concept of the pyramid of culture was being quietly revived. except that now there were some elements of popular music were co-opted into that structure. A distinction was made between, on the one hand, serious artists who concentrated on albums and extended solos and intricate changes in time signatures, and on the other, the disposable pop musicians who made singles that were inherently unimportant. It was pretty much the same as the distinction that had existed at the end of the previous decade between trad jazz and rock and roll. In the late 1960s, the white boys who played copies of old American blues music were appreciated by grammar school sixth formers, but pop songs, which included contemporary black American music on Motown, Stax and Atlantic, this was only suitable for the working class to dance to. And the hope, again, was that everyone's taste might eventually be elevated so that they could appreciate the worthiness of blues rock and jazz rock and folk rock and all those other hybrids that seemed to be embarrassed to be called rock and roll in the first place. And what actually happened, of course, is that in the end pretty much everyone came around to the conclusion that Smokey Robinson, James Brown and the Temptations were more entertaining and frankly better than, I don't know, take your pick, John Mayall's Blues Breakers or Yes, Pentangle, whoever, these groups that have largely faded. I think it's also noticeable in retrospect at least that it was this supposedly disposable music that allowed greater scope for women, for black people, for gay and lesbian performers. Ultimately, it proved more inclusive and more democratic. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk today about the advent of rock and roll in Britain, because I think it represents one of the biggest shifts in British society since the war, and that is the rise of popular culture as the most important driving force of social change. Popular culture has, I would argue, reflected and shaped and sometimes driven developments ever since Elvis. When the Ku Klux Klan and the East German press and the Daily Mail and all the rest of them denounced rock and roll as a plot to undermine their way of life, they were quite correct, all of them. Rock and roll and the wider culture that it represented was a threat to existing establishments of all political hues, because once the genie of popular taste was released from the bottle, it became impossible to put it back. The people decided that their voice should be heard, and once it was heard in one area, the demand to be allowed access to others was soon to follow. The rejection of the third programme in favour of Radio Luxembourg is perhaps a trivial thing, but the insistence on choosing our own culture rather than having our taste shaped by our elders and betters, that was a decisive step on the path to democracy. And I think the full implications of that are only now being played out, because it's a long process. One of my favourite lines in David's most recent book which covers the turn of the 1960s. So he writes, "Change was coming, but as usual with change, somewhat slower and somewhat later than often assumed." The explosion of rock and roll in the 1950s, and obviously other events of the era, I single out rock and roll only as the most obvious manifestation, but I think these things began to transform British society, subtly nudging it from deference and towards democracy. They also represent a move away from community and towards individualism. Looking back 20 years after the event, a British rock and roll fan reflected, "The first time I heard Little Richard, I thought, Christ, how is this not illegal to get this much sex, energy, drive and violence onto a piece of plastic?" But I want to end with the great broadcaster and social campaigner Ray Gosling, who died a couple of years ago and has always been a big hero of mine. He was born in 1939, so he was 16 when Rock Around the Clock came out in Britain, which means by Eric Hobsbawm's definition that he must have been mentally rather retarded, because he was in the first wave of those who fell in love with rock and roll. And his explanation of the phenomenon remains my favourite statement on the subject ever. Rock and roll, he said, was a euphemism for sex, but not with the girl next door. We wanted to fuck the world. And I think that's what it achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Alwyn. That was terrific. I'll throw open to the floor in just 1 second, but if I may, one question from me, one question. The point you make right at the end, that rock and roll, or rock music generally, or whatever you want to call it, kind of accentuated individualism. So, in a way, the notion that's become quite common, hasn't it, that, as it were, the rockers of the 60s became the Thatcherites of the 80s, and Mick Jagger, I guess, is always the person who's, you know, often the most cited in that in that sort of respect. And I can sort of see it. And yet, some years ago, chatting to an old friend, we've been friends since the early 70s, and shared many much our musical tastes together and so on. And we were just talking about the counterculture and so on of the late 60s, early 70s, or what we kind of grew up into, or just about got the tail end of. And he said something that really struck me, which was that back then, when young, late 60s, early 70s, what it, in a way it was all about was trying to create some sense of community, but of course community amongst ourselves. So if we were listening rather reverentially, as I certainly did in my last year or two at boarding school in the late 60s, on a Sunday afternoon to John Peel's Top Gear, which with one or two friends, we just sit in the room, absolute silence for 2 hours, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, while we just soaked it all up. The kind of stuff I think on the other side of your musical fence, Alwyn, if I understand you rightly. But I think it was partly we're thinking a lot of other people were also listening quietly and reverentially, no doubt, to Peel, and it was sort of the tablets coming down from on high in a way, and it was a kind of community thing. Or you went to a festival, Isle of Wight, or whatever it might be, or Bath in 1970, and so I just think in a way. It's a slightly more complicated story.
I think that's certainly true. I think it's the need for community is still very strong. I think you see it in the need now for people to have shared experiences, whether it is Glastonbury at the extreme that it is, or I guess the most obvious example from the last couple of decades was the death of Princess Diana and the response to that. The need to feel that you are part of something bigger.
And people going to cinemas for live feeds of opera and stuff is a kind of version of that, isn't it?
But I think in terms of the music, the pop music, I think the great divide that opened up in the late 1960s is between private and public music. And what you're talking about is a group of people listening privately to the music that John Peel played, which is not the music that you would hear in a workplace.
No, of course
you wouldn't
not.
hear it being played on a jukebox in a pub.
No.
That music that was shared seems to me much more powerful.
Yes. No, I think, in terms of the numbers, for a start.
Yeah, but also the fact that it was a more collective experience, I think. Tony Blackburn, when he was getting 18 million people listening to him, that was being played in offices, in factories, and people were sharing that music. They listened to it communally. So I think there is that element.
No, I would accept that, I think I would. So we've got 10 minutes roughly. So we've got a roving mic. The gentleman there to kick us off.
I'd be curious about your thoughts about the censorship of the time. And, for example, all plays had to go through the Lord Chamberlain's office, etc., etc. What kind of censorship did this popular culture have to break through, and can that give it hope to other places in the world today which are facing censorship?
There was an enormous amount of censorship on the radio in particular. The one that I've always enjoyed was 1963, a group called the Cougars, who were kind of a rip-off of the Shadows. They did instrumental guitar music, and they had a hit with Saturday Night at the Duck Pond, which was a melody adapted from Swan Lake, and it was banned by the BBC for insulting classical music. And this is after the Beatles. This is not the 1940s. This is relatively enlightened times, but it was still, and the BBC was still happily banning everything at that stage. And the the response of the people to that was simply to ignore the BBC and to find other means of expressing themselves and to listen to other, which is why the pirate radio stations rise so rapidly. And they were huge. You know, Radio Caroline's final broadcast got 20 million listeners in 1967. Radio Luxembourg back in the 1930s had done exactly the same. It had destroyed the BBC listenership, because if you don't provide the music that people want, then they will find it elsewhere. And I think that's the reason that I'm incredibly optimistic and hopeful for the future, is largely because I think we now have in the internet the start of something that enables us not to rely on maverick entrepreneurs to go and set up a radio station on a boat, but actually to do it for ourselves. And that seems to me the impulse, the democratic impulse that I think has dominated Britain since the 1950s in cultural terms, now is starting to find a way of expressing itself that wasn't there in the past. And so stuff that had been suppressed and had been marginalised, it is now possible to have direct access. And I'd say I'm full of hope for this. It seems... I was listening to the last session here, and there seemed to be a bit of general gloom about how the 60s had failed. But I think you have to take a longer view of this. These things take generations.
Would anyone else like to? Yep, David.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Could you say a word about the influence of thinkers like Richard Hoggart and the uses of literacy, which is not a patrician disdain for a sort of popular culture you describe, but comes from a sense that we are losing a sense of the social culture of working class communities through the sort of popular culture that you describe being repressed in this way?
I always had a suspicion that Richard Hoggart was possibly romanticising a bit too much of his youth, and was too denigrating of the world that was emerging. And he didn't...
The candy floss world, he called it, didn't he? Yes.
Which I have no problem with candy floss. It felt to me that, along with other commentators from the time, there was not enough trust put in the taste of ordinary people. It still felt to me like he was telling people off for not fitting in with his image of where community should be, rather than allowing an organic development of that. He had the same anti-American bias that I think runs through much of British attitudes of the time. But I may be being unreasonable to him.
I think Uses of Literature is a deeply anti-American. The second half of it is deeply anti-American book.
And that,
I mean, it's pretty. You know, there's not much. You know, as it were, nuance in it. It is fiercely anti-American.
It seems to me. I mean, obviously, in retrospect, I can't view it from the time, but he was wrong, because the American influence was coming. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of point to me in railing against that. It feels to me you need to embrace it and try to influence it, rather than standing against the incoming tide. You need to shape that and use it, and trust the people will make the right decisions. But I don't know. As I say, it feels to me like there's a kind of things were better in my day, and it's all gone. It's all going to pot, which is obviously
well, it was quite
tempting.
I mean, it was for all of the first half of the book, for all its exceptional vividness. I mean, it's a wonderful piece of writing, the first half of the book, his recreation essentially of his childhood in Hunslet in the 20s and 30s. But I think it's pretty, it has a sentimental element to it, doesn't it? So I would share your suspicion.
It's the world that he's left behind.
And it's not even possibly a wholly disinterested version of that world he left behind, for all its vividness. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. You talked a couple of times, and in the last one of the answers as well, about democratisation. And I see that. I do see there's a cultural democratization and different people maybe getting access to making culture and listening and stuff. But isn't it, can we add to that picture the fact that as pop music has become more and more mainstream and it's become everywhere, and the establishment has embraced pop music and the Prime Minister likes pop music, actual political democratic engagement has gone down. And if you were to compare, turnout now to turnout in 1951 or 55, it's collapsed. Now, so if we take your idea, there's a connection between popular culture and social change, which you said, maybe there's a rather unhealthy connection there too.
Turnout has collapsed completely. 35% of the registered electorate didn't vote last time, plus the many millions who weren't registered in the first place. Spike Milligan used to have a joke where he said, one day the don't-knows will win, and then where will we be? The don't-knows have won the last 3 elections fairly comprehensively. And they came close to winning in 97. My feeling with that, I think that is related to a democratisation of culture. I think it's related to the fact that the existing political system, and we're now drifting a long way from the Elvis stuff here, but the existing political system is not designed for the purpose it is now being put to. The idea of representative democracy relied on a small electorate. Back in 1832, with the first Reform Act, an MP represented on average somewhere around 1,700 people, all of whom were male, all of whom were property owners and came from a relatively small social background. They send one of their own to Parliament to represent them, and he represents them. The average MP now, rather than 1,700 electors, now has 70,000. You simply do not have any connection with that person. This is not what the system was intended for. It doesn't work, and it will change, I suspect. I think it has become kind of irrelevant, and it's one of the reasons why political parties become increasingly irrelevant, is because it simply isn't fit for purpose, in the modern buzz phrase. Representative democracy is no longer representative. But that's a kind of separate argument, I guess. But there is... While we're on that, I have a feeling that this election will be looked at in future as possibly the last election fought under the old system with the old parties. It feels to me like there is a big change coming. I'm not sure that it's in any way clear what that will be, but in the post-war period particularly, where the culture, the popular culture, has been out of harmony with the political culture, that has tended to preempt change. So in the 1950s, when you have people raging against this old establishment that is not addressing their needs, it does produce change in the 1960s. In the 1970s, political culture is very clearly predicting the rise of Thatcherism at a time when the political establishment and political commentators were not, when they thought that the future probably lay with Tony Benn and with a trade union-dominated world. Actually, popular culture was looking towards Thatcherism.
So culture is the canary in the mine, really.
I'm not...
I find, I mean...
It is that, but I think it also helps to shape it. The reason I ended with a picture of the Sex Pistols is I think the punk is inherently Thatcherite. Punk celebrates the small business, the entrepreneur. It rejects the legacy of the 1960s. I think it kind of points the way forward to Thatcherism.
It has its own kind of... It has its own force. No, that's, I mean, terrifically interesting.
And in the present day, we have this disconnection with a House of Parliament that clearly isn't representative, and a popular culture that is demanding to be heard. And all the nonsense that was talked about how more people voted in Big Brother than in an election, which started in 2001. There is some truth in that.
No, we've got to finish now because I gather they're using the QEH or whatever for event this evening. Thank you so much. Wonderful to finish. On the one hand, we're looking ahead to 2020 and beyond. On the other hand, we referred back to 1832 and the world of Middlemarch. So this is good stuff. Thank you so much for coming this evening, Dave. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.